Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come learn with us. My name is Jamal Robinson. I'm an implementation consultant here at Continia North America. You're here at the Continia Expense Management Partner Training Program. So we will be focusing on our product expense management. We'll be focusing on Business Central cloud implementations for the purpose of this program. So, as a partner, why would you want your clients to choose expense management as their expense management solution? This allows us to automate the expense reporting process within Business Central and on the go. You can submit your expenses from anywhere in the world. We have a mobile phone application. We also have a website where users can submit their expenses. You can email receipts, take pictures of your receipts over your phone, and attach them to expenses through our app. We're fully integrated inside of Business Central. So the ease of use for accounting teams and for your clients who might be using Business Central for the first time, it's a great way to implement this type of solution because the user interface and because the integration is just like Business Central. It allows for um, the implementation and the learning aspect of the solution that your client is able to really understand and really learn two solutions at the same time um, because we're fully built inside Business Central. So we're here at the partner training program. This is the program agenda. It is a 4-week program, 2 days a week, and it's broken up in 8 sessions. We're here today at session one, where we'll talk about an introduction and foundation to expense management in Business Central. Our next session this week, we'll talk about user setup and configuration of expense management users. And in the following weeks, we'll talk about each of the relevant areas of setups for expense management. We'll dive into what expense types are, how to configure mileages and per diems, how to configure the fields and the web approval portal and the approval process. We'll talk about corporate credit card processing. A lot of our clients like to use corporate credit cards with Continia Expense Management. So we'll show you how to process corporate credit card transactions. We'll talk about using the expense management app and website to submit expenses. So we'll talk about the end-to-end expense process. And then finally, as you as the partner is learning how to implement expense management, we'll talk about how to prepare for go live and how to properly migrate your sandbox setups of expense management into your client's live production environment. So, what to expect from this program? I just want to give a high level overview what this training program is intended to be used for. This is an essential skills program detailing the implementation lifecycle. So here at Continue, my role is to train partners and to train clients in using our solutions. I support partners during implementations. So I'll be talking about the perspective of a partner, the pitfalls, and where you might find that you want to focus on when you're implementing expense management. So we'll talk about the key areas, the key setups, and the key configurations. This program is intended for new consultants and those just learning about Continia. This is a basic, starter program. Maybe you've implemented Continia 1 or 2 times before. Maybe you're brand new to Continia and you want to get a full overview on what the solution is and what is the basic default foundational setups and key configurations of expense management. The content of this program is your guide to the best practices of Continia North America. So we will be focusing on US clients and the best practices of a US implementation. I know that we may have some Canadian partners on the call. Some of the best practices definitely could be applied to Canadian clients. There might be some aspects of Canadian implementations that will not be covered during this program, mainly geared towards handling of those sales taxes on the expense side. So this program will be focused on US clients. For those situations for our Canadian partners, specifically around the Canadian sales tax piece, we might not have time to cover that. Please submit a support request to our technical teams if you need support on the sales tax piece of expense management. We'll be happy to help you through our support area. So each session has been allotted 2 hours to cover the relevant material. Hopefully, not all sessions will be 2 hours long. There is a lot of content to cover, so I do wanna make sure that you're fully aware of all of the areas and the functionality of the solution. So I would like to make sure that we're covering all of the topics. If time allows, I'll definitely end early, but please plan to, hopefully be here for 2 hours. Sessions will be recorded and shared to everyone afterwards. So if you need to drop off, feel free to do so, and we'll send you the recording, and you can, catch the ending if you missed the ending. Just know that you will be muted during these sessions to stay on track with the time allotted. There's a Q&A tab inside of the Zoom meeting. So if there's questions that you may have during a training session on a topic that I'm covering during the session, please use the Q&A tab and give us your questions. And we will attempt to respond to those questions via email, because I will be sending out follow-up emails and recap emails with that recording. And I'll try to answer any questions from the Q&A tab via email if I'm able to answer them in an email. If it's a topic that we might need to dive in deeper, perhaps if there's time in the beginning of a call, I can, you know, revisit and discuss a question from the Q&A tab if we have time before we dive into the next topic. But if you need further support, please submit a support ticket with our technical support team, and we can coordinate potentially getting on a personal call to help you with your specific issue. I will be checking knowledge and confirming your understanding of the topics that we cover in each session through the use of the polls feature of the Zoom meeting. So I will be, you know, asking you some questions, and I welcome you to answer the polls that I ask during the call, just so we can confirm that we're on track and that you understand a particular topic that I want you to really understand and cover. We also would utilize the chat feature to confirm your understanding on a particular topic that I might cover in a particular session. So we're here today at our first session for the introduction and the foundation of what expense management is and how would we start the process of implementing expense management. So your sales team may have sold a deal for expense management, and then you as the consultant has been tasked to implement the solution for your client. So we'll talk about how to properly start an implementation. What are the key questions and considerations that you want to have as the partner, as well as the type of conversations that you want to have with your client before you introduce the client and you start your sandbox testing and you get them familiar with the solution. So we'll talk about how to install and activate our application inside of Business Central. And we'll also explore how to do some initial setups of expense management when you first activate to get your client on the right foot. Okay, so your partner sales team has just sold a deal and they told you that you need to implement expense management. So, what are the first things that you might need to do? So, the first thing you want to do is confirm, do you have a partner zone account? So, as a partner with Continia, you have access to what is known as Continia Partner Zone. This is a website and an internal portal that has a plethora of resources that you as the partner can take advantage of. You'll need your login credentials for Partner Zone in order to activate our solutions within Business Central. So if you do not have access to Continia Partner Zone, you want to coordinate with your Continia partner account manager to make sure that you can gain access and you can log in because you'll need your login credentials to activate. Next, you want to confirm, do you have the current version of the Continia project work plan? So the Continia project work plan is an internal document that Continia has created to manage implementations for our solutions. So this is a resource that we at Continia North America use for our implementations if we would implement a project directly. So we would want you as the partner to also use this document because it's coming directly from us and it provides the best case scenario for you to really make sure that you're covering all of your bases and you know exactly what's involved in a Continia implementation. So if you don't have a continued project work plan with you today, you want to request a work plan from your Continia partner account manager and use that work plan as your resource to manage the implementation. I'll go through this Continia project work plan today during this call so you're fully aware of its contents and you understand how to navigate that document. It's a very robust Excel work plan document. So as a partner, you want to gain access to your client's environment, of course. You want to create a current copy of your client's production environment to create a sandbox. We suggest that you always do your testing in a sandbox environment. Everything that we've done in the sandbox could be migrated to your client's live production environment. So we want you to create a sandbox for the purpose of the implementation. And as a partner, we want to make sure that your account has super permissions across all companies without any restrictions so that you can navigate the solution and not run into any errors. You want to confirm, are the master records up to date? So this is your vendors list, your employees list, your chart of accounts, your dimensions. This is very important because if we're doing any migration from sandbox to production, we want to make sure that we're migrating the data that is consistent between those two environments. We'll be doing mappings, obviously, to different accounts in the system. So in Sandbox, if you do a mapping to an account that doesn't exist in the production environment, then all the work you've done in Sandbox it is for nothing because we want to make sure that whatever you transfer from Sandbox production is consistent between the two environments. And then you also want to complete some level of client discovery before we start implementing and before we introduce the client to the environment and they begin their testing. So here are some areas that you want to discuss. You want to gather our test users. So who are going to be our project leads, our admins, our expense users that will be testing? What is the approval process looking like for your client? What would they like approvals to go? And who are those approval users that will be setting up? You need to be aware that in order to be an approval user in Continia, you need at least a Teams member license in Business Central. A lot of partners and clients miss this key aspect. While being an expense user does not require a Business Central license, being an approval user does require a Teams member license. So sometimes people get confused with that distinction. So to use expense management, you don't need a license, but to approve expenses, you need at least the Teams member license. So you want to talk about the data that your client wants to set up, right? We want to talk about the posting accounts for different areas of expense management. We're talking about our expense types and our balancing accounts for corporate credit cards that they're using it. We want to talk about their dimensions. If they're using dimensions, what are the dimensions that they want to implement for expense management? So you want to get the client thinking and giving you this information to better prepare you so you're not going back and forth and waiting to gather this information before you do the setup. If you can get all of this information prior to the install and activation, that really just prepares you to completely set up the environment before the client even gets introduced to the solution and starts testing. A lot of what expense management is that initial setup. So once you've set up the environment, all that is left is for your client to test and get comfortable with using the solution. So you want to help yourself out by doing the legwork beforehand and gather all this information from the client. So when you actually get the access to the sandbox, you can start right away and just set up the environment, enter in all the necessary data, and get your client started on the right foot. So if your client is using different currencies, what are those currencies, and are those currencies set up in BC? What are the mileage rates that they want to use if they want to use mileages? And then we will also need an email account set up in BC for the purpose of outbound email notifications. So within expense management, we can send out some notification emails, such as the welcome email, which can be sent out to expense users, approval emails that can be sent out to approval users when they have something new to approve. And we can also send out reminder emails when an expense user needs to submit an expense. And then finally, we want to confirm what date does your client want to go live. This helps us plan for how many meetings might be necessary and how long the client needs to test before you migrate from sandbox to production. Okay. So right now I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go into what is known as the Continia project work plan. You should see an Excel document. So this is the Continia project work plan for expense management. This is a very detailed Excel workbook. As you can see, there's several tabs on this document, and each tab does different things. We're going to focus on the first tab, which is estimating. The estimating tab allows you as the partner to define the scope and help you quote hours for this project. We want to understand your client and we want to ask the relevant questions that can help us with not only defining the number of meetings we may have, but it also would help us define how many hours might be involved in a project for this client. So within the estimating tab, we would like to ask certain questions that will help us understand the client better. Like, how many transactions does this client process a month? And how many companies does your client want to implement for expense management? And if they do want to implement multiple companies, do these companies share master records between them? These two questions are very important because this can determine the size of the project and the amount of hours involved to implement. Let's say your client has multiple companies, but each company does not share the master records. Maybe the chart of accounts is different. Maybe they use different dimensions. Maybe their users list is different. So if your client wants to implement multiple companies, but each of those companies are not the same and they're not consistent between them, that would essentially mean you're doing multiple implementations. Like I said before, within expense management, we'll be doing mappings to existing accounts within Business Central. So if one company has mappings to accounts that do not exist in the other companies, then you'll essentially have to implement expense management separately in each company because each company will have its own unique set of mappings. So I see a lot of partners get into trouble because they only quote their hours based on thinking that they can copy the setups, but when they get into the project, it's actually more involved than that because they have to duplicate their efforts separately for each company, which increases the amount of hours you're spending on a project. So you really want to understand what you're dealing with and you want to answer these questions. We want to know who are the individuals that we'll be dealing with at the client level. How many administrators are we working with? How many expense users will be setting up and testing? And how many approvers are involved to set up? This also means, how many licenses you might have to purchase. And then when it comes to user setup, users will also dictate the amount of hours because, you know, one implementation for 20 users will be different than an implementation with 500 users, right? So you definitely need to know the scope of how many users you're dealing with because that can affect the hours that you're quoting your client. We want to know how many corporate card relationships your client has. This is not the individual number of cards that your client has, but this is the number of overall account relationships that your client may have. So your client may have 50 corporate credit cards, but it's only under one umbrella account. So that means we only have to communicate and set up one account. But if they have multiple accounts with multiple providers, that means your client would have to reach out and make sure that they're communicating with each provider to make sure that we're creating the connection with each provider between Continia and Business Central. So this question is not the number of individual cards, but we want to know the number of account relationships your client wants to implement with Continia. Does your client want to utilize the mileage and per diem module? So this is usually a yes or no question. Depending on the answer, this might increase the training and the setup time and the testing time that your client needs to be involved with in order to get familiar and comfortable with using that functionality aspect of expense management. So we would like to know if your client wants to implement multiple modules. Does your client want to implement the Continia Web Approval Portal? The Continia Web Approval Portal is a separate website specifically designed for the approval process. So if your client has approval users that they do not want within Business Central, but they still want them to approve, we can implement the Web Approval Portal. The Web Approval Portal will require an app registration in your client's Azure Active Directory. So we would need to coordinate with the client's IT department or whoever has access to their Azure portal because they would need to create an app registration for the Web Approval Portal in Azure. We would like to know if there's any customizations in your client's environment that might affect the order of entry, the validation, or the posting of expense transactions. So if your client has customizations that might affect posting or validation of certain fields, we would like to know about it because we might need to extend and develop our expense management application to account for your customization. So you need to be aware and ask your client if there's any customizations in their BC environment. And then finally, is your client utilizing a different localization? Most times for North America is either US or Canada. And we have a specific US application for US clients, and we have a Canadian application for Canadian clients. So depending on the localization, we'll determine which application you need to download and activate within Business Central. So we would like to know if your client is utilizing a different localization. So the questions that you answer in the estimating tab will then transfer to the services tab, which would give you a recommendation from Continia on what we feel might be the hours involved into a project based on the answers to your questions. So the services is mostly driven by the number of companies and the amount of users that you're setting up. But this is just Continia's recommendation. I do not suggest that you just take this number and give it to your client. Obviously, you as the partner have your own capacity needs, you have your own business needs. So just take this number from the services tab and use it as a baseline to then determine your own hours that you as the partner might want to give and quote your client yourself. So the services tab shouldn't be the final word. It's up to you as the partner to take this number and based on your own needs and capacity, quote your own hours to your client, but you can use this as a recommendation. Also, based on the answers to your questions from the estimating tab, it then comes into the project plan tab. The project plan tab is the standard basic amount of tasks and meetings involved in a Continia expense management implementation. So this is what Continia feels are the number of meetings and the milestones that you can keep track with during your implementation. So most times you've already had a demo, you've already have completed your client discovery. So the client should already be aware and know what expense management is, and you should already be talking about their current process. The technical kickoff is between the key decision makers at the client and the client's IT department, where we talk about the pre-kickoff requirements and we're assigning the activities that the client and you as the partner need to do in order to do the initial install and setup of expense management. So the technical kickoff creates those pre-kickoff requirements, which allows you to do an initial install and configuration. Not until you gather all the necessary information that you need to do your configuration should we introduce the client to have any sort of kickoff call. Hopefully, the environment is set up to introduce the client for them to start the process of testing the solution. We can have a meeting where we discuss the approval process. What does your client want approvals to work with within BC? And we can talk about how to handle that within Continia. Here are some tasks. So we will talk about the user setups. We'll complete that, the configuration of the solution, assigning permissions to the users, and completing the web approval portal setups with the client's IT department, that app registration. And then these are just some meetings that could happen where we'll talk about the key areas of the solution to make the client aware so that they're completely comfortable and they're confident in their setups that you have done as the partner. So we'll have a meeting when we're talking about expense types. We'll have a meeting where we'll discuss mileage entries and per diem setups if it applies. We'll have a meeting where we'll discuss corporate credit card processing if it applies to your client. And then we'll have sessions about user setup and then the individual user training. Now, again, the success of an expense management implementation depends on your client testing and using the solution for themselves. So each meeting involves some level of client testing. The client has to go off on their own and use the solution themselves. So I see a lot of projects go off the rails because you, as the partner, have done the setups, but then the client has never tested on their own. And now you get to the go live date and you're forced to go live, and the client is not comfortable because they never tested, they never posted, they never processed expenses. They're not comfortable with taking this solution live because once you're live, you're with real data, you're hosting real life transactions, and it will be very hard to, you know, correct mistakes. So it's very, very important that the sandbox phase, the testing phase is fully realized. Post transactions, process corporate credit cards, reconcile those credit cards, reimburse users in your sandbox. You can make mistakes in the sandbox. So please have your clients test in their sandbox prior to go live. If you need support from Continia prior to go live, please let us know because we need to prepare for it. We have many partners. We service many partners and clients. So we have our own capacity considerations. Please reach out to us if you're struggling and we can coordinate support for you. So if you need post go live support, please reach out to us to schedule a time. So this is the project plan. You can use this as a base to create your own project plan. You don't have to use this. This is just how Continia manages these projects. If you want to create your own plan and use this as your base, by all means, take this information and create your own plans for your own business, for your own clients, depending on their situation. Not every meeting might be necessary because it might not apply to your client. Okay, next. So while we're in the project plan, during this technical kickoff, you will utilize this pre-kickoff tab because these are the types of conversations and this is what you want to think about as a partner and you want to get the client to start to think about during that technical kickoff before you install, before you activate, before you set up the environment. This is part of that client discovery piece that I mentioned earlier. We want to identify the resources at the client level. We want to identify those corporate relationships for the corporate credit cards if it's applicable to your client. So there's different ways to handle corporate credit card transactions. They can either import transactions automatically inside of BC, or they can import transactions manually. If they decide to import transactions automatically, you need to be aware that it can only be implemented in their live production environment. So you would always have to teach them and bring in transactions manually if they want to test the functionality in their sandbox. What you need to be aware of with automatic versus manual imports of those transactions, the only way that you can automatically import transactions inside of the BC environment is if your client has a corporate level relationship with their credit card provider. So I sometimes see partners and clients get confused because they think that they can implement an automatic data feed, but when they talk to their bank, they actually cannot do that because the type of corporate credit card they have is not a true corporate level card. Sometimes clients only have a business level card with their provider. So it's very important that you start this process early, that you have your client communicate with their bank to determine whether or not they have a corporate level card or a business level card, because that determines how are we going to handle those transactions with expense management. Could it be an auto feed, or does it have to be a manual feed depending on the type of card that they have? Now, let's say that they do have a corporate level relationship and that they could implement an automatic data feed. So if they confirm that they have that ability, we need to start the process now to communicate with the bank and to submit the necessary forms with the bank for the bank to implement the auto feed. We cannot control how long it takes for the bank or for the provider to implement the data feed. So we recommend to start this process first because we don't know how long it can take. So we provide links to our documentation, and depending on the provider, either Visa, MasterCard, American Express, go to the doc site, click the relevant link for the provider, and we provide instructions on the type of conversation you need to have with the bank and what they need to do on their end to implement the automatic data feed. So this is the first thing that you want your clients to do if they want to implement corporate credit cards and expense management. Regardless of that, we would need your client to provide to you a CSV file of their bank transactions, because we'll need to bring in these transactions into Sandbox manually. So the client would need to go to their online banking, go to their corporate credit card, and export a CSV file of their transactions so they can provide it to you so that you can import them manually into the Sandbox for them to do the testing of the corporate credit card process. So regardless if they're implementing automatic or manual feed, they still need to pull their transactions from their online banking and provide it to you if it's applicable, right? If your client is using continuing expense management for corporate credit cards, this is a part of the pre-kickoff requirements. Have them get those CSV files to you, okay? Something of note that I see this happen a bunch of times, especially with our Canadian partners, and they're dealing with those Canadian clients. With these corporate credit cards, we are posting in local currency of the Business Central environment. So within that data set of the corporate credit card transaction, there should be a transaction amount, and then there should be a bank posting amount. So let's say your client is using corporate credit cards in multiple countries and they're utilizing multiple currencies. There's the transaction amount in the foreign currency, but the bank is going to post in an amount that is the local currency of the bank. So sometimes I see Canadian partners try to use a US card in a Canadian environment, but that US card for your client, there is no sort of currency exchange rate because it's a US card transacting in US dollars and the bank is posting in US dollars. So the environment doesn't know how to do any sort of currency exchange. Inside of BC, you should have a separate company where the local currency is the local currency of the BC environment. So if it's a Canadian client who uses a corporate credit card and it's a US card, they should have a US company in their environment where the local currency is USD if that card, everything is in US dollars. But something that your client could do is reach out to their bank and see if the bank can post in Canadian dollars since their environment, the local currency is Canadian dollars. So sometimes clients might need to reach out to their bank and say, hey, I know that this is a US card, but I'm trying to bring it in for Canadian dollars. Could you post in Canadian dollars for the purposes of the data feed? So if for our Canadian partners on the call, if you find yourself in that situation, have your client reach out to their bank and see if they're able to do that for you. But the best practice is you should have multiple companies in BC where the local currency is what gets posted because we're going to post in local currency of the transaction. So here's where we talk about those accounts, right? Have your clients start to think about the accounts that they want to use, the expense type posting account for expenses, the balancing accounts for corporate credit cards, um, have them start to identify if they need to set up multiple currencies if they use them, have them start to think about what mileage rates that they want to use if they want to implement mileages, and help them identify if they need to expose any dimensions. So dimensions could auto-populate in several areas of Business Central. And because we're built inside Business Central, we could default in some dimensions from different places. So if BC can default in a dimension, maybe you don't need to expose the dimension to the expense user and make the expense user responsible for entering in the dimensions. So have a conversation with your client about, how do they want to handle dimensions? Could it be defaulted in from BC? Or do we want to make the expense users responsible for entering in the expenses? Or do we want to make approval users responsible for entering in the dimensions during the approval process? We want to identify our users. Like I said, the expense users that we're setting up and the approval users we're setting up. So we want to gather like a list of our test users. Who are the users who will be in Sandbox and testing the solution? Those are the users that we want to focus on, and those are the users that we want to set up. The client's IT department should create an outbound email to be used within BC for the purpose of notifications. So this should be an Office 365 mailbox. So not only does the client's IT department need to create the outbound email, but they need to create the web approval portal. So these are two activities for the client's IT department that you should make them aware of before you introduce them to make sure that the environment is set up appropriately so they can test properly in the sandbox. So here for you as the partner, you talked about their go live date. You've already confirmed and quoted your hours. You have an account in Continia Partner Zone. We'll need that to activate. You'll have those permissions to install and activate and do the setups, super permissions across all companies. Of note, those delegated partner accounts that you might have, you need to know that you cannot run a job queue, you cannot send out outbound emails, and you cannot log into the web approval portal with these delegated admin partner accounts. So maybe your client could create a licensed user account for you as the partner if you want to be able to test out this functionality. If not, have somebody at the client run these things. We'll do the install and activation of the product. You'll verify that the sandbox data and the master records is consistent. And this just talks about how we want to install and activate, right? We want to allow HTTP requests for our applications. We want to install the relevant localization, either for US or Canada. We have a Canadian specific app. So for our Canadian partners on the call, you definitely want to make sure that you're downloading and installing the Canadian application for expense management, because this is where we have those sales tax functionality. We want to make sure that the users have the appropriate permission sets to use expense management. Depending on the amount of users that you're setting up, it might be relevant to create security groups, Azure security groups. Add the permission sets to the security group. So all you have to do is add users to the relevant security group. So depending on the size of the project, maybe utilizing security groups is a good way to manage users. We have the outbound email, we have the web approval portal, and then finally, we want to think about how do we want to store those receipts? Do we want to store those receipts inside of the Business Central database, or do we want to use Azure Blob Storage? This all depends on your client's volume and the size of the BC database. So we could migrate receipts in the future if you find that it's taking up too much space. And here's Continia's recommendations for that Azure Blob account. You can take these recommendations, or you can create your own based on your own client's needs. Okay, so that's the kickoff requirements. These are the questions and considerations that we have before any sort of client kickoff. We're hoping to gather all this information and we can properly set up the environment before we invite the client in. We have a kickoff tab that can help you manage your notes for the client. We have relevant links to our documentation, common pages, and common functions. So that's why this work plan is so important, that I really want you as the partner to really dive in, get this document if you don't have it already, and really pay attention to what's going on within these tabs, especially like Go Live, right? Because the Go Live tab lays out step by step the considerations and what you need to look out for and the steps to migrate from sandbox to production. So I'm not going to go through this tab yet. I'll go through it in our Go Live session at the end of the program. But, again, we lay it out, everything that you need within this work plan. Okay. So I'm going to launch a poll. So I just launched a poll. The question is, what client pre-kickoff tab is important to start immediately if applicable? Okay. Thank you for those who answered the poll. The question was, what client pre-kickoff tab is important to start immediately if applicable? The available answers was user setup, email setup, approval setup, or corporate credit card activation. The answer was corporate credit card activation. So remember, Continia or you as the partner, we can't control how long it may take the bank or provider to implement the data feed. We don't want it to hold up production when we go live, right? So we want to start this process immediately if your client wants to implement corporate credit card transactions for the use of Continia Expense Management. Okay, so let's take a short break. We'll take 5 minutes. Let's come back at 12 p.m. Okay, we're back. So we're in BC now, and we're going to go to the area to install and activate expense management. So you as the partner, we're in BC Cloud. We'll go to extension management, and you'll go to App Source Gallery. And once you're in App Source Gallery, you can search for Continia Expense Management. And, here's the list of the apps. Here we've downloaded the US specific application for expense management. For our Canadian partners, you'll find Continia Expense Management Canada, or I believe it's CA for Canada. So when you go to expense and management, you'll go to App Source Gallery, you'll search for Continia Expense Management, and you want to make sure you're downloading the right localization, either for US or for Canada. Okay. And once you install and activate, you'll go to our app. So we'll go to Continia Core. You'll confirm that allow HTTP client requests is turned on for Core, and as well as the individual app itself, turn on allow HTTP client requests. This allows us to talk to Continia Online. So you want to make sure for the sandbox that you're allowing HTTP client requests. So after you've installed from extension management, there's two places that you can go to activate. Let's start off with the first place, Continia Solution Management. So you can search for Continia Solution Management and you'll see the app that you've installed, and you can go to Manage Subscription to start the activation process. You want to confirm your modules. So everybody gets Essentials because that's the base module. If your client wants to implement corporate credit cards, we'll make sure that the credit card transactions module is on. If your client wants to use mileages, we'll enable the mileage module. If they want to use per diems, we'll enable the per diem module. This payroll integration is not used in North America, so I would not suggest that you activate this module at all. But from here, you'll go to Manage Subscription. It'll pull up a wizard. You'll enter in your partner's own credentials, and then you'll update client information, and you'll activate the solution from Continia Solution Management. So that's a way you can do it. Or you can search for Set Up Expense Management. Going to Set Up Expense Management, the first time that you do it in Sandbox, it will also prompt you to activate the solution with your partner's own credentials. After you would have activated via Continuous Solution Management, it would have taken you to Set Up Expense Management. You will click Next. And when you're installing and activating for the first time, the action would be import configuration from online. Importing configuration from online would load in our demo and sample data. So as you can see, I'm going to import the configuration from online. And if we expand this, you can see that we're setting up the environment so that your client could use it right away. It will be up to you as the partner to take control of these default settings and change these to reflect your client's own customizable criteria for how they want expense management to be set up. So out of the box, we give you some sample payment types. We give you some sample expense types, some fields, and reminder codes. So we will load the environment with some sample data to get you started on the right foot. So we definitely want you to run Set Up Expense Management the first time that you install and activate. And we want you to import configuration from online to start the process, okay? So after you import configuration from online, we'll go to the page Expense Management Setup. Expense Management Setup is the administration page where we'll do the initial configurations for the overall expense management solution. You'll start off by confirming the document storage method. Are we going to store receipts in the database, or are we going to store receipts in Azure Blob Storage? If you turned on Azure Blob Storage, you'll then need to enter in your credentials for the account from the Azure setups for that storage account. So enter in your credentials in BC here. I'll just change back. You'll confirm, hey, when the client is utilizing their application on their phone, how long do they want to keep the history within their app? Do they only want to keep it for 6 months? Do we want to do a year's worth or never? By default, it's 6 months. And do we want to inform the user on the app and send them notifications through the app? So we can do it instantly, never, or scheduled. They would also have to ensure that notifications are turned on within their phone settings, right? So they're using iPhone or Android, they would need to go to their app settings there and make sure that enable notifications are turned on for the app itself. Here, we'll talk about the web approval portal. So to do the setup, we'll go to setup, web approval. So after the client's IT department creates the app registration, we'll enter in the Azure credentials here inside of expense management setup. And we'll talk about the web approval portal setup in a future session. But just know that we're entering in the Azure credentials in setup web approval. Okay. We want to confirm the application modules, obviously, depending on the modules that they've activated. And you want to have a conversation about expense reports. Does your client want to manage expenses at a report level, or do they want to manage expenses individually? So by default, expense reports are optional, meaning that an expense user could submit an expense individually, or they can submit expenses as part of an expense report. You can disable it completely if they don't want to use expense reports, or you can make expense reports mandatory. And that means a client could not submit an expense unless it's attached to a corresponding expense report. So this will kind of affect the use of expense management on an expense user's level, especially with those corporate credit card transactions, right? Because as your client is using corporate credit cards, we will be creating expenses based off of those transactions. So expenses will be going to the user's application or their portal for them to submit. If expense reports are mandatory, your client will always have to make sure that expenses are attached to expense reports before that they're able to submit them. So depending on how your client manages their users and how they manages expenses, sometimes I've seen projects where a client only allows for their users to submit one expense report a month. That means in the beginning of the month, the client had to create the report and leave it open. And throughout the month, as they create expenses, they would always have to make sure that they're attaching expenses to the report and then submit the report at the end of the month. So using expense management might be a little different for the user if expense reports are mandatory. When they're optional, that means they can submit individual expenses as they come in, or they can decide to create reports and submit expenses as expense reports. So it all depends on the client and their particular business needs. Okay. So for each transaction, and I'll open up each individual transaction. So for each individual transaction, we're going to make sure that we're going to auto submit for approval. So if there's no errors, if there's no warnings on a particular expense, when an expense user submits that expense, we want it to auto submit for approval. So we want to make sure that this is toggled on every time. If your client wants to have a unique description for an expense report, you can create a unique description here by looking up to it and entering it in here. So sometimes I see partners and clients say that they want a different type of description for the transaction within BC. And then you might want to ask your client how they want expense reports to be posted. Do they want a single entry for that expense report, the way it gets rolled up? Or do they want separate entries per document type? Maybe they want all mileages to be grouped together. Maybe they want all per diems to be grouped together in those entries for the expense report. Or do they just want it blank? They don't care about how it's grouped. So you might want to consider how your client wants expense reports to be posted, and you want to test that functionality. That's why it's very important that during the sandbox that they're testing the different methods. They're getting used to how things are posted. They're getting comfortable with how transactions are flowing within their BT environment. So play around with it, have the client test it out. For expenses, we always want expenses to submit for approval automatically. So if there's no errors, if there's no warnings on that expense, we want you to auto submit for approval. Again, if they want a different posting description for expenses, they can create a different posting description. This is a setting that, hey, if the client wants expenses posted in the expense currency and not within the local currency, you can flag this. But currently, you would have to create some sort of development today if you want to pay back the vendor in a different currency. So remember what I said previously when we discussed corporate credit card processing and those transactions inside of BC, we're going to pay the vendor back or the user back in the local currency of the environment. So we've had requests from partners before where they might want to reimburse a user in a different currency. Maybe they have users in different countries and they want to reimburse the user in their own foreign currency and not in the local currency of BC. Today, it requires a customization. In the future, Continia hopes to release in our future versions a way to reimburse the expense user in a different currency. But today, it's currently set up that we're reimbursing expense users in the local currency of the Business Central environment. So for US clients, if the local currency is USD, we're paying back users in USD. If it's a Canadian client where the local currency is Canadian dollars, we're reimbursing users in Canadian dollars. We have the ability to enable what is known as amount distribution codes. So within expense management, within those expense types, we could auto allocate or auto split an expense to multiple expense types if your client has a use case for it. So if your client wants to create an expense type where if it's selected, it automatically splits to multiple expense types in the system, we would have to enable what is known as amount distribution, and we would have to create that amount distribution at the expense type level. And I'll show you how to do that in a future session, and you'll see it in practice through practical examples that I'll show you during the program. Okay. We come to those bank transactions. So these are for those corporate credit card transactions. This is a very important setting when we're talking about corporate credit card transactions and how do we process corporate credit card transactions. So the post at import setting means that when transactions get imported into the system, it's going to immediately post to the relevant balancing account that is set up for that corporate credit card account. So you'll give us a balancing account, and you can either use a bank account, you can use a GL account, or you can use a vendor. And we'll talk about those setups in a future call. It's driven through what is known as a payment type. So each corporate credit card relationship will have a relevant payment type. And within that payment type is where we'll configure the posting accounts for that corporate credit card account. But posting at import means when we import transactions and it gets matched to that payment type, it's going to immediately post to the balancing account for that payment type. And it's also going to hit what is known as an intermediate posting account. The intermediate posting account is a temporary clearing account. It is used for the purpose of this post at import, and it's a holding account up until the point that the expense user chooses the relevant expense type, and then it reverses out of the intermediate posting account, and then it hits the expense type posting account. So the intermediate posting account should have a running balance of 0 if your expense users are entering in expenses on time and choosing the expense type, because it should reverse out of the intermediate account and it should hit the relevant expense type expense posting account. Posting at import allows you to reconcile at any given point of the transaction. So a transaction could be pending the expense user. The expense user hasn't entered the expense in yet. It could be pending approval. It can be approved and released, and it could be posted. Posting at import means regardless of the expense status for the transaction, you can still reconcile the corporate credit card account. If we turned off the post at import, you lose certain settings. When post at import is turned off, you cannot use expense reports. We would have to disable expense reports. Instead of using expense reports, you would have to, if they wanted that functionality, they would instead have to use a purchase invoice. And a purchase invoice is the same as an expense report at the end of the day. It's just a collection of different transactions in that purchase invoice versus a expense report. But turning off the post at import means that you would have to wait for every expense to be posted before it hits the balancing account, which would mean you would have to wait for every expense to be posted before you're able to reconcile the corporate credit card. So that's why it's very important that we turn on post at import, and that's why we highly suggest that you utilize the post at import and you utilize the intermediate account, because it allows you to reconcile immediately. It allows you to reconcile the corporate credit card, and you don't have to wait for every single expense to be posted before it appears on that balancing account, which would allow you to reconcile the corporate credit card account. So let's drop a yes or no into the chat if that makes sense. What is post at import? What is the implications of turning it off, and why you want to turn it on? Okay. Then we have the mileages. We're always, like I said, we're always going to auto submit for approval for those mileage expenses. Okay. So if there's no warnings, if there's no errors, we want mileage expenses to be automatically set for approval. You want to confirm the unit of measure. We're most likely going to use miles. I know sometimes maybe Canadian partners want to use kilometers. So you just want to make sure that the relevant unit of measure is there. Do you want to allow for a variance between, let's say your user manually enters in the amount of miles that they travel for a given expense? Do you want to allow for a difference between what a user may manually select as what they traveled versus what the system calculated for that distance between the address, the to and from address? So we're using Google Maps to determine the distance between a from address and a to address when we submit those mileage reimbursements. But sometimes a user could overwrite and manually enter in the miles that they've traveled to. do you allow for a difference between what we calculate versus what the user may manually enter in? We have this feature called calculate across all companies. This is for users who are within multiple companies. So if you want to add together, because we keep track of the amount of miles that a user travels to within the period that a mileage rate is active for. But if your client is using multiple companies and if they have mileages in multiple companies, do you want to add together all of those mileage expenses and those distances across all of those companies for that a particular user, right? So we're keeping track with the total distance that they're traveling. Do you want that calculation to add together all of the potential companies that a user might be set up between? So that's what that is doing. And then obviously, if you want a unique description for the mileage, we'll do that as well. Again, for per diems, we're going to auto submit for approval. Do you want to allow for different destinations to be selected within a given per diem trip? So multiple destinations and multiple accommodation types allow for multiple setups. So within the per diem setup, you can have different rates and you can post to different accounts based on a location. So within BC, you can create locations, which is like countries within BC, right? So you can have a particular country or location, and each location could have a different rate and a different posting setup. So if you want to allow your users to engage multiple locations, which would engage multiple rates and different posting accounts, we might want to enable this setting to allow for a user to select different destinations when they select and enter in a per diem expense. Because each day could have a different location if you give the user the ability to enter in a different destination for a given day that they're traveling to within a per diem. Okay. And I'll show you those setups when we have our session about per diems. So per diem rates could be driven through different codes. It could be driven through different locations, and you can get really detailed the way that you set up a per diem expense setup. Here we want to talk about how do we want to enable the allowances under those per diems. So we have different allowance types. Accommodation is self-explanatory for accommodation. Meals is for meals. But then we have these other accommodation allowance types for entertainment, drinks, and transportation. So there is a calculation method for the accommodation allowance, and there is a calculation method for meal allowance, which I'll discuss when we have our call about per diem setups. While these two have a calculation method, entertainment, drinks, and transportation are a flat fee, a flat rate. So depending on the days that they travel to, if entertainment allowance is selected, they just get the rate that you've entered for that allowance. You can decide, do we want to give the allowance to the user by default, or do we do not want to give them the allowance by default and have them have to select, I want to claim this allowance when I am entering in a per diem expense. So enabling it by default means all the user has to do is enter in the days that they're traveling to. And if accommodation is selected, they get the allowance um for that day. Same thing for meals. If you give the allowance by default, they would receive breakfast, lunch, and dinner based on the number of days that they're traveling to. If you do not give them the allowance by default, that means for each day, the user will have to go into the meals allowance and select, hey, today I'm claiming breakfast. Today I'm claiming lunch. Today I'm claiming dinner. So whether or not you want to give them every meal by default, or would you rather have them select which meal that they want to claim for that per diem? And then same thing. Do we just want to give them the allowance by default based on the number of days that they're traveling? Or do we want to have to make them select, today I'm claiming this allowance, so I'm not going to give it to them by default? So let's drop a yes or no into the chat if that makes sense. Are we going to give the user the allowance by default, or are we going to have to make the user select and claim the particular allowance? Okay. And then if you want a unique posting description for per diems, we can give a unique posting description for per diems. Here we have custom fields. So within expense management, you could create custom fields for the purpose of expense capture. And if you've created a custom field for expense management, we have the potential to add that field to Business Central so the Business Central administrator can see that field. So custom fields are associated with the expense entry. It doesn't really do much, but just relate the expense. So if there's customizations in your client's environment, if you want to create a custom field, but have it post differently, like let's say like intercompany fields, or that's a use case, or maybe your client is using multi-entity management, there might need to be some development and extension of expense management to take that custom field that you've created and have it post correctly inside of BC to wherever you might need it to function within the environment. So out of the box, if you create a custom field, it will just be associated with the expense. But if you actually wanted to do something within the environment and transfer, or maybe post to a particular ledger or do something different, you would need to have a conversation with our technical resources so that we can make expense management aware that it's doing what you need to do correctly. You would just add that custom field to BC from the drop down here. As you can see, most times it deals with our shortcut dimensions. So if you've created a shortcut dimension for the use of expense management, we would add those shortcut dimensions within the customizable fields so that you can see that shortcut dimension within BC. And this is for every transaction, either for expense transactions, mileage transactions, per diem transactions, or if you want to add it to the expense report header. And then here's that email that I discussed. This is the outbound email that is used for the purposes of notifications. So if you click the hyperlink, this would just take you to the standard BC email accounts page. We use the default email account that is set up in BC. So your client's IT department will add an email account, and then they would follow the wizard. Most times it's just a Microsoft 365 mailbox. Well, I can't connect that now because we're in a demo, but you'll add the account, and I suggest that you provide your client this link because it talks about the permissions on that shared mailbox that needs to be in place in order to properly send out those outbound notification emails. So come to this wizard, send them this article from Microsoft so that they're aware on how to properly set up that outbound email. So we have the welcome emails, we have reminder emails. So you have the ability to create a custom text for the header subject line for those emails. So we have welcome emails, we have reminder emails for the expense user, we have approval emails for the approval user. We also have status report emails that you can send out to those expense users. So if you want to filter the status report, maybe you only want to show them posted documents, or maybe you only want to show them non-posted documents. You can say that, or maybe you only want to show them reimbursed expenses or non-reimbursed expenses, or do you want to send them all transactions within that status report? And then for the posted documents piece, if you wanted a date range when we send out those status reports, say, all right, maybe I only want to show the current month within the status. So if you want a starting date and an ending date, you can implement that here. Okay. So this is expense management setup. Okay. I'm going to launch another poll. So I just launched another poll. The question is, what is the main benefit of utilizing that post at import? Okay. Thank you. So the question was, what is the main benefit of turning on post at import? The available options were purchase invoices, expense reports, reconciliation, and the intermediate account. So this is a little bit of a trick question because the main benefit, the primary benefit of utilizing post at import is that reconciliation piece. Because when transactions are imported, it's immediately hitting those balancing accounts for that corporate credit card account. That means that you're able to reconcile that corporate credit card account at any point of the expense. So an expense could be pending expense user, it could be pending approval, it could be approved and released, and it could be posted. So at any given point of the expense, you're still able to reconcile the corporate credit card account because post at import is turned on, and we are posting those transactions to the balancing account that is set up on the corresponding payment type. Okay, so going back, so just to recap, the expense management key fields. So these are the key fields that you might want to consider when you're doing the initial configuration of expense management. You want to confirm your storage method. Are we going to use the database or are we going to use Azure Blob Storage? You want to have a conversation with your client about how they want to handle expense reports. Do they want to make them mandatory? Do they want to make them optional? Or do we want to disable them completely? Just know that if they decide to turn off post at import, you cannot use expense reports. You have to instead post to purchase invoices. Okay. So that's the key here. So no expense reports means you have to use purchase invoices instead if they still wanted that similar functionality, but post at import has to be turned off. So usually I see expense reports in most cases, they're either optional or they're mandatory. And we talked about how expense users might have to change the way that they process expenses if the expense reports are mandatory. We want to make sure that the auto submit for approval is turned on for every single transaction. That's very important. If there's no errors, if there's no warnings, we're going to make sure that we send those expenses for approval right away. Do your client want to post expenses in the expense currency? So I talked about the implications of that today, that, today we're going to pay back the expense user in the local currency of the BC environment. So even if your client is posting in the expense currency, when they process the reimbursement, we're going to do that exchange back to the expense user in the local currency of the environment. Does your client have a use case to turn on amount distribution? So does your client want to automatically split expense types to multiple expense types possibly. So we can explore, and I'll show you the functionality of using that automatic amount distribution to multiple expense types. We talked about how important the post at import function setting is important, and you want to make sure that that's turned on. And we want your client to use that intermediate posting account. So that intermediate posting account will inform your client if the expense user is not properly entering in and processing their expenses. Because if there is a balance in that intermediate posting account, that means the expense user hasn't entered in the expense and hasn't posted the expense yet. Because if they did, that expense would have reversed out of the intermediate posting account and it would have hit the expense type expense posting account for the expense. You talked about setting up the mileage, the base settings for mileage, and the base setting for per diems. Do we want to enable those allowances by default? Or do we want to make the expense user responsible for claiming a particular allowance for a particular day? We have those custom fields that could be added to Business Central if you've ever created a customizable field for the use of expense management. And then finally, the email that is associated with expense management to send out the welcome email, the reminder email, and the status report email. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's session. We've done an introduction and foundation of expense management. We talked about how you as the partner need to start off the project on the right foot by utilizing the Continia project work plan and complete those pre-kickoff requirements, right? Have those early conversations with the client. Gather all the necessary information that you need to properly set up expense management before we bring in the client to start testing, hopefully, right? If you can get that from your client. We talked about the basic system settings. We'll talk about the role center, and we'll did that initial configuration of expense management setup.